She was pregnant when he said, "I cheated." A year later, he found her in a hospital, holding twin daughters with his eyes. Emma Carter used to believe that timing was the most important part of love. She believed that when two people found each other at the right moment, everything would unfold the way it was meant to. But life had a cruel way of proving her wrong. She realized this on the day her entire future collapsed with a single sentence from the man she trusted more than anyone. She had spent the entire morning rehearsing how she would tell Nick Bennett that he was going to be a father. She imagined dozens of possibilities. Maybe he would freeze in shock and then smile in excitement. Maybe he would take her hands and swear to protect their family. Maybe he would be overwhelmed but eventually thankful. She even pictured tears, joyful ones, rare ones, from a man so guarded that vulnerability seemed foreign to him. She never once imagined what actually happened. She stood in his office, heart pounding, palms sweaty, and when she finally spoke the words, those quiet, trembling words telling him she was pregnant, Nick looked at her as if she had offered him a disaster instead of a life. There was a tense, breathless moment where she thought he simply needed time. Then his expression hardened, turning cold in a way she had never seen before. "I cheated on you," he said flatly, the confession delivered with the same tone he used in business negotiations. "This changes nothing." For a heartbeat, Emma didn't understand. She blinked, waiting for him to say something else, anything else, something that explained this was a mistake or a cruel joke. But he just closed his laptop and stood up, already done with the conversation. She took a step back as if the air between them had become too sharp to breathe. Her voice cracked as she asked if he really meant what he said. He nodded with an indifference that made her knees weaken. It wasn't just what he said. It was how effortlessly he said it. As if she had never mattered. As if the moments they shared, coffee breaks where he brushed her hand, stolen kisses in the elevator, the night he whispered that she made him feel alive, were nothing but illusions she had created in her own naive heart. When she left his office that evening, she wasn't the same person who walked in. Something inside her tore open, and the pieces fell at her feet. She returned to her apartment in silence, unable to cry because the betrayal was too raw to comprehend. She sat in the dark, staring at the wall, her mind fighting the truth that the man she loved had never loved her back. Or worse, maybe he had, and he chose to throw it away anyway. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes she saw his face, emotionless and distant, telling her that she meant nothing. In the small hours of the morning, when exhaustion finally dragged her into a shallow sleep, she dreamed of holding a baby who looked up at her with blue eyes full of questions she couldn't answer. The following day, she arrived at work only to discover her employee badge no longer granted access. Security politely escorted her away. No explanation. No goodbye meeting. Her email was deactivated. Her existence was erased with the efficiency of a company handling a minor inconvenience. The message was clear: she was no longer part of his world. And neither was the child she carried. She sat outside the building on a bench, one hand on her belly, whispering apologies to a life she feared she couldn't take care of on her own. Fear crawled up her spine, fear of homelessness, of judgment, of failure. Her parents had always criticized her for chasing city dreams instead of staying close to home and finding a respectable husband. They would not help. They would say she made her choice and deserved whatever came after. Her friends existed mostly in her phone, busy with careers and relationships of their own. She felt the weight of isolation press down on her lungs. That evening, she made a decision that altered her future forever. She went home, packed her belongings into 2 suitcases, and stared one last time at the apartment that held all her foolish hopes. She didn't leave a note. She didn't send a message to Nick telling him she was disappearing. She didn't want to give him even a fraction of the power he once held over her. As she stepped into the hallway, a wave of nausea twisted her stomach. Pregnancy symptoms had been intensifying for days. She leaned against the wall, breathing shallowly, terrified of what the next months would bring. The bus station smelled of rain and diesel when she arrived. She bought a ticket to a town she had never heard of, somewhere far enough that Nick would never think to look for her. On the ride, she pressed her forehead to the cold window and wiped silent tears away before they could fully fall, determined not to let the world witness her breaking. Every bump in the road jolted not only her body but the fragile belief that she could survive this. But in her arms, wrapped in the coat she clutched tightly, there was a new beginning quietly forming. Inside her, 2 tiny hearts beat without doubt or fear. 2 lives that asked nothing of her except love. When the bus finally reached the small town, dawn was breaking. Emma stepped out into a quiet street, breathing in air untouched by the chaos of the city she left behind. She felt lost, terrified, and heartbreakingly alone. But she also felt something else. Something small and fierce rising beneath her pain. For the first time since her world shattered, she placed both hands over her belly and whispered, "We're going to make it." It wasn't a declaration of strength. It was a promise born from desperation. But it was enough to take the next step. And that was how her life began again, not with joy or hope, but with courage that didn't yet feel like courage. She didn't know it yet, but she had already survived the worst. What lay ahead would be hard, yes, but it would also be filled with a love stronger than anything she had ever imagined. The town Emma arrived in wasn't anything special. It didn't have grand buildings or bustling streets, and most people had lived there their entire lives. But to her, it was a kind of quiet she hadn't known she needed until she stood in the middle of it. The bus stop was small, just a bench beside a faded map and a vending machine with broken buttons. The morning air was cold, sharp, and smelled faintly of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Emma stepped off the bus with her 2 worn suitcases and the weight of everything she had left behind pressing heavily on her chest. Her body was exhausted, her back aching from the long ride and the strain of carrying twins, though they were still months from arriving. There was no welcome committee, no one waiting to help her. She didn't expect there to be. All she had was a printed list of cheap motels and her last few $100s in cash. The first place she tried was full. The second had a room, barely larger than a closet, but it was clean and warm, and the old woman at the front desk didn't ask questions. Emma took it. For the next several days, she barely left. Her body demanded rest, and emotionally she was too raw to face anything beyond survival. Her morning sickness worsened. She had to ration her food, living on instant oatmeal and crackers. The sounds of people in the rooms next to hers, laughing, arguing, living their lives, reminded her how completely alone she was. Still, every morning she got up, splashed cold water on her face, and opened her laptop to search for work. She took freelance editing jobs, transcribed audio files, and wrote product descriptions for obscure websites that paid pennies per paragraph. The work was tedious and unglamorous, but it kept the lights on and gave her something to focus on besides the ache in her chest and the slow, terrifying reality of single motherhood. Her pregnancy progressed quickly, more difficult than she imagined. She began to show earlier than expected, and the doctor at the local clinic confirmed what the ultrasound technician in the city had hinted at before: twins. Hearing it again, out loud, was like being handed a mountain and being told to carry it alone. Emma didn't cry in the doctor's office. She just nodded, asked all the right questions, and walked out as if nothing had changed. But in the safety of her tiny motel room, she sat on the floor and let the tears fall. Not from regret, but from fear. Fear that she wouldn't be enough. Fear that she'd fail them before they were even born. Fear that one day, she might look into their faces and see him, see Nick, and not know how to separate the pain he caused from the beauty of what he unknowingly gave her. But alongside the fear came something else. Resolve. Each time the twins kicked, each time she placed her hands on her stomach and felt their growing presence, a small part of her healed. They didn't ask her to be perfect. They just needed her to try. She stopped thinking about what Nick had done and started thinking about what she could do. She found a tiny one-bedroom rental above a hardware store. The owner, a widowed man named Frank, offered her a discount after she helped organize receipts in his back office one afternoon. He said she reminded him of his daughter. Emma cried in the stairwell afterward, not because she was sad, but because someone finally showed her kindness without expecting anything in return. She bought second-hand baby clothes at the thrift shop and repurposed boxes into storage bins. The crib she assembled herself from a broken one left out on the curb, sanding it down and repainting it with trembling hands. Every day, she did something small that brought her closer to the life she wanted to build for her daughters. Her body was changing rapidly now, her back often aching, her ankles swollen, and sleep coming in brief, restless waves. But she kept going. She stopped counting the months she had left and instead counted the small victories, every paycheck cleared, every new stretch mark earned, every kick that reminded her she wasn't alone. By the 8th month, Emma had managed to build a fragile kind of stability. She worked part-time for the local library from home, managing their website and helping with fundraising copy. She volunteered twice a week, sorting donated books and helping kids find something to read. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't anything like the life she once imagined, but it was hers. The townspeople slowly came to know her, not deeply, but enough to nod in recognition when they passed her at the corner store or offer her a seat at the park when she was too tired to stand. Some whispered. A young woman alone, pregnant with no husband in sight. But she learned to ignore the sideways glances and focus instead on the rare moments of warmth, a stranger holding the door open, a teenager offering her the last seat on the bus, the librarian who left a stack of newborn books on her desk without a word. When labor finally came, it was sudden and frightening. She was alone, as always. The pain ripped through her in waves, and she barely made it to the hospital in time. The delivery was long, difficult, and dangerous. Her body trembled with exhaustion and blood loss, and for a moment, everything faded to black. But then she heard it. The first cry. Then the second. Two voices, small and fierce, announcing their arrival into the world. When the nurse placed the girls in her arms, Emma looked down at them, blue eyes wide open, already alert, and everything inside her cracked open and healed at the same time. They looked nothing like her. They had his eyes. His bone structure. His stubborn expressions. But they were hers. Completely. She named them Sky and Sadie, names she had once scribbled in the back of a notebook during her darkest hours, unsure if she'd ever get to say them out loud. She whispered those names over and over again as she held them close, promising them a life better than the one she had known. She didn't know how she would do it. She had no plan beyond tomorrow. But for the first time in months, she wasn't scared of what came next. She had already survived the storm. What remained now was the rebuilding. And she would do it, brick by brick, lullaby by lullaby, one day at a time. Nick Bennett had everything he'd ever wanted, or at least, everything he once thought mattered. His name graced the covers of magazines, his business decisions influenced global markets, and his calendar was filled with back-to-back meetings, exclusive events, and dates with women he never truly knew. People envied him. They called him brilliant, unstoppable, a genius in the boardroom. He played the role well, sleek suits, fast cars, $1 million smile. But none of it touched the hollowness that had started to spread like rot beneath the surface. For months after Emma left, he didn't think about her. Or rather, he told himself he didn't. He pushed her out of his mind the same way he filed away old projects, closed, irrelevant, a memory buried under newer, shinier distractions. At least, that's what he told himself every time he looked at the empty spot in his office where she used to sit, every time he caught the faintest trace of her perfume on an elevator, every time he rolled over in bed and found the space next to him cold. He had expected her to fight for him, to call or plead or ask him to reconsider. But she didn't. She vanished. Completely. No calls, no messages, not even a whisper through mutual contacts. At first, it annoyed him. Then, it unsettled him. And eventually, it started to haunt him. Who just disappears without a trace? Who walks away from someone like him, Nick Bennett, and never looks back? The truth festered like a splinter. He tried to numb it with women, with deals, with weekends in private villas and champagne-drenched nights. But none of it stuck. No one laughed like she did, off guard, without trying to impress. No one looked at him the way she did, like she saw the parts of him even he avoided. No one challenged him, disarmed him, or stood their ground the way she had that day in his office. The last day he ever saw her. He remembered the look on her face when he told her he'd cheated. He told himself he was being honest, being cruel for her own good. But if he dug even a little beneath the excuse, he knew what it really was: cowardice. One night, nearly a year after she left, he was in his penthouse, alone, the city glittering beneath him like a lie. He poured himself a drink and opened the drawer where he kept odds and ends, paperclips, old receipts, notes he never read. That's when he found it. A scrap of paper, folded small, yellowed around the edges. Her handwriting, unmistakable. He hadn't remembered keeping it. The note was short, just a sentence. If you're ever truly lonely, remember who you walked away from. His chest tightened. He read it again. Then again. It hit him like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was heartbreakingly true. He was surrounded by luxury, power, influence, and none of it could fill the emptiness she'd left behind. The next morning, he didn't go into the office. Instead, he began making calls. Quietly, without alerting anyone. He hired a private investigator. He didn't tell them much, just her name, a photo, the date she left. At first, they found nothing. No credit activity, no new address, no phone in her name. It was as if she'd fallen off the planet. Weeks passed, then months. The investigator finally located a paper trail, an out-of-state clinic bill, a rental agreement in a tiny town he'd never heard of, a public library employment record under her maiden name. That was when he learned the most jarring piece of information of all. She hadn't just disappeared. She had given birth. Nick sat in stunned silence as the investigator listed the facts with clinical detachment. 2 girls. Twins. Born 3 months after she vanished. No father listed on the birth certificate. He barely remembered how he made it home that night. He kept replaying the timeline in his head. The night she told him she was pregnant. The cruel words he threw at her. The months he spent pretending it didn't matter. He had twins. Daughters. And he had never even known their names. He didn't know if they cried when they were born or what color their blankets were. He didn't know the sound of their laughter or the way they looked when they slept. The weight of that realization broke something in him that had never cracked before. He couldn't focus. Meetings blurred into noise. Food lost its taste. He stared at pictures of her town, imagining her pushing a stroller down quiet sidewalks, taking the babies to the park, maybe struggling to pay rent while he sat in glass towers drinking $1,000 scotch. The guilt wrapped around his throat like a noose. He tried to work, to bury himself in numbers and strategy, but for once, none of it could distract him. He dreamed about Emma. About faceless little girls who turned away from him when he tried to reach them. About crying he couldn't stop, tiny voices calling for a father who never came. Eventually, the shame turned to urgency. He needed to see her. Not to be forgiven, he didn't deserve that. But to know. To see the faces he had walked away from. To understand what it meant to be a man who had created life and abandoned it. He didn't know what he would say or how she would react. He had no plan beyond showing up. He just knew he couldn't go on with this hollow shell of a life knowing they were out there and he had done nothing. He booked a flight without telling anyone. Not his assistant, not his board, not even his driver. For the first time in years, Nick Bennett went somewhere without a script. He packed a duffel bag and wore a hoodie instead of a tailored suit. He didn't want to be a CEO anymore. He didn't want to be the man who had built an empire and burned down something far more valuable in the process. He just wanted to be a father. Or at least, if it was too late for that, a man who tried to make things right before it was truly unforgivable. As the plane descended toward the small rural town, Nick looked out the window and realized he had no idea who he was anymore. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he was terrified. Not of failure or money or power, but of standing in front of the woman he had broken, and the daughters he had never met, and finding that he had waited too long to become the man they needed him to be. Nick stood in front of the small town hospital, the kind that looked more like a converted schoolhouse than a medical center, his hands cold despite the early spring sunshine. He had flown across the country and driven for hours into unfamiliar roads with only one address scribbled on paper, a trace left behind from a medical bill the investigator had uncovered. He didn't know what he would find. Maybe Emma had moved. Maybe she'd changed her name again. Maybe she'd refused to even look at him. But something inside him needed to try, even if it meant being rejected at the door. He entered the hospital with a pit in his stomach, not from nerves alone, but from the weight of everything he had done, or failed to do. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman with graying hair and a soft voice, gave him a curious glance when he asked about Emma Carter. He realized then how strange he must seem, an outsider, obviously not from this quiet town, with a desperate look in his eyes and a name he hadn't spoken out loud in over a year. She asked if he was family, and for a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't, not technically. But the words left his mouth before he could stop them. "She's the mother of my children." The woman blinked, then nodded, her expression shifting from suspicion to something else. Concern, maybe. Or understanding. She directed him to the second floor, to the pediatric unit. Nick's pulse quickened as he climbed the stairs, the hum of fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell making him feel like an intruder in someone else's story. He had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard soft voices coming from one of the rooms. A nurse walked past, and he caught the name Carter printed on the chart she held. His feet moved before his brain could stop him. The room was small, bright with sunlight filtering through pale curtains, and filled with soft cooing sounds. Emma sat in a worn armchair by the window, her brown hair pulled back into a loose bun, her eyes tired but alert as she cradled two tiny infants in her arms. The girls were sleeping, nestled against her chest in matching pastel onesies, their chubby cheeks rising and falling with each breath. They were so small, so impossibly perfect, and Nick froze in the doorway, the sight of them stealing the breath from his lungs. Emma didn't see him at first. She was focused entirely on the babies, humming a tune under her breath that he didn't recognize. But then she looked up, instinct pulling her gaze toward the door. When their eyes met, time seemed to stop. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her face went blank, stunned, then shifted into something colder, disbelief, followed by anger, then something far more devastating, hurt. She rose slowly, careful not to wake the babies, and placed them gently in the bassinets beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped toward him. Nick tried to speak, to explain, but his voice failed him. He didn't know how to fit 12 months of silence, betrayal, and guilt into a sentence. Emma reached the doorway and closed it softly behind her, leading him into the hallway. Her face was unreadable, but her voice was calm, too calm, when she finally spoke. "What are you doing here, Nick?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I found out about them. I didn't know. I didn't know you went through all of it alone. I came to see you. To see them." She crossed her arms, staring at him like he was a ghost. "You didn't want to know," she said. "You made that very clear." He flinched, because she was right. He had cut her off with cruel efficiency. And now he stood in front of her with regret weighing down every word. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I said things I didn't mean, and I've lived with that every day since. But I swear to you, Emma, if I had known, if I'd understood what I was walking away from, I would have never." She shook her head, stopping him. "You don't get to rewrite what happened. I begged you to believe me, and you looked me in the eye and said you didn't care." Her voice cracked now, years of pain rising to the surface. "Do you know what it's like to go through childbirth alone? To hold 2 newborns and have no one to call? I didn't even have car seats when we left the hospital. I wrapped them in blankets and rode the bus home." Nick's stomach turned. He imagined her holding the twins on that bus, trying to protect them from cold stairs and bumping roads, while he had been sipping scotch in silence, trying to erase her from his thoughts. There was no apology big enough for that. All he could do now was listen. "I'm not here to make excuses," he said. "I came because I want to be part of their lives. I know I don't deserve it. But if there's any way to start, anything I can do, please let me." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw the toll the past year had taken on her. She wasn't the same woman he remembered. She was stronger now, but also more guarded, as if every kindness had to be weighed against the risk of being hurt again. And she had every right to feel that way. "They're not a second chance for you to fix your guilt," she said. "They're people. Tiny, trusting people who only know love. If you want to be part of their lives, you have to earn it. Slowly. Quietly. Without breaking anything else in the process." Nick nodded, his throat thick. "I'll do whatever it takes." She didn't answer right away. She stepped back into the room and stood beside the bassinets, watching the girls sleep. Then she glanced over her shoulder. "You can sit. But don't touch them." He obeyed, taking a chair in the corner and sitting stiffly, watching the twins as if they were a miracle he didn't deserve to witness. That day, Nick didn't speak much. He watched. He listened. He saw how Emma rocked them, how she whispered their names, Hazel and Lily, how one liked to sleep with her fist curled under her chin and the other sucked her lower lip in her sleep. He memorized everything, terrified that it might be the only day she ever let him close. But at the end of the visit, Emma didn't ask him to leave. She handed him a folded blanket and told him which side to place it on. It was a small gesture, but it cracked open a door that had once been slammed shut. Nick walked out of that hospital with a promise burning in his chest. He had been the reason Emma broke once. He would spend the rest of his life making sure she never broke again. Nick left the hospital that first day feeling as if his heart had been ripped apart and stitched back together incorrectly. He sat in his rental car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel and forcing himself to breathe. Inside that building were two tiny humans he had helped create, and a woman he had nearly destroyed. He had spent his entire adult life believing that control was his greatest advantage. But this situation? This wasn't something he could control, buy, or manipulate. If he wanted to be part of their lives, he would have to earn his place one careful, humble step at a time. And that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. The next morning, he returned to the hospital before visiting hours even began. He waited outside in the hallway with a cup of tea in his hands, not coffee, because the nurse mentioned Emma hadn't been allowed much caffeine. When she arrived pushing the twins in their bassinets, she frowned, confused to see him already there. He didn't push conversation. He simply offered her the tea, quietly stepped aside, and kept his distance unless she asked for help. That became a pattern. Every day for 2 weeks, he showed up, not demanding access or affection, but offering whatever support he could manage, holding the elevator door when her hands were full, bringing her meals so she didn't have to think about cooking, rocking one of the babies when Emma looked like exhaustion might swallow her whole. The nurses began to whisper about him, impressed by his devotion and struck by how gently he handled the newborn girls. Children usually terrified him. Their unpredictability and neediness unnerved him. But Sky and Sadie were different. The first time he held Sadie, Emma watching him like a hawk, he was terrified of doing something wrong, of dropping her, of breathing too loud and startling her. But then her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and something shifted in him so violently he nearly came undone in that plastic hospital chair. These were his daughters. His. The realization felt like lightning, painful, bright, undeniable. The more time he spent with them, the more he noticed the details. Sky had a tiny dimple in one cheek when she yawned. Sadie always stretched her arms above her head before settling into sleep. Sky whined if she wasn't swaddled tight. Sadie preferred more room to wiggle. When they cried, their voices were distinct, Sky's sharp and indignant, Sadie's softer but persistent. They were tiny, but full of personality. He couldn't believe he had ever tried to pretend they didn't exist. Meanwhile, Emma watched him with a mixture of caution and reluctant curiosity. She didn't praise him or encourage him, but she didn't shut him out either. If something needed doing, she let him do it. If she was exhausted, she let him take over for a while. She didn't smile at him, not yet, but the sharp anger in her eyes slowly faded into wary patience. When the twins were finally discharged, Emma faced a challenge Nick hadn't anticipated. She explained this to him the night before they were released, her voice tight with tension. "I don't have car seats," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "They're too expensive. I was saving up but, it's more than I can manage right now." He didn't even hesitate. The next morning he arrived with 2 brand new infant carriers and a practical stroller. For a moment, Emma looked like she might refuse out of pride alone, but then she glanced at the sleeping girls and sighed. Love for her children outweighed her pride. She accepted the gift with a quiet, strained thank you. Nick didn't say anything back. He just buckled the seats in as carefully as if they were made of glass. Bringing the twins home was supposed to be a triumphant moment, but reality hit Emma fast. The apartment was small and poorly heated. There was only one crib. There were barely enough blankets. Nick stood awkwardly in the center of the room, taking in the cracked walls, the thrift store furniture, the fragility of the life she had built from scraps. He realized how much she had sacrificed. How much she had endured alone while he had been living in marble and leather, complaining about delays in a catering schedule or the wrong bottle of wine. Guilt landed heavily on his shoulders, nearly suffocating him. He offered to help fix things, install shelves, baby-proof the outlets, build a second crib, but Emma hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted independence. She had built this life alone. Accepting help now felt like admitting she needed him, and she had taught herself not to need anyone. But when one of the babies cried and Emma moved too quickly, wincing in pain from the strain on her recovering body, Nick stepped forward without waiting for permission. He scooped Skye up and walked the room gently, humming under his breath. Emma watched, and for the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked tired. And grateful. That evening, when he moved to leave, she surprised him by quietly saying, "You can come back tomorrow." That was all. But for Nick, it was everything. Days turned into a routine. He spent the mornings helping Emma adjust to the demands of 2 newborns, feeding schedules, diaper changes, endless laundry. The work was messy and exhausting, and yet, it became the most meaningful part of his life. He found himself looking forward to the early hours when he could hold Sadie while Emma fed Skye, their tiny breaths warming the air between them. He celebrated every small milestone, the first time they focused on a face, the first accidental smile, the first time they grasped a toy with determination rather than reflex. Meanwhile, Emma began trusting him with more. She would shower while he watched the girls. She would nap while he folded laundry. She even let him stay for dinner once or twice a week. They weren't a couple. They weren't even exactly friends. But they were partners in survival, learning to navigate parenthood side by side. One evening, as he washed bottles at the sink while Emma rocked Skye in the worn armchair, he caught her watching him. Not with suspicion this time, but with a quiet sort of shock. She looked like she was seeing a different man than the one who had broken her heart. And perhaps she was. Nick still carried his guilt like a shadow, but he was changing. And he wanted her to see that change, not through words or apologies, but through every diaper he changed and every bottle he warmed and every tired smile he earned from his daughters. But for all the progress, there were setbacks too. Nights when Emma cried silently into her pillow, overwhelmed by fear that he would leave again once the novelty wore off. Days when Nick questioned whether he could ever make up for the year he missed. Moments when old hurt rose between them like a wall neither knew how to climb. Yet they kept trying. Because 2 tiny girls depended on them to figure it out. The turning point came one night when the power went out during a thunderstorm. The girls woke up crying, the room too dark and cold. Emma panicked, but Nick sprang into action. He found flashlights, lit candles, held both babies and soothed them with soft murmurs and gentle rocking until their cries tapered into sleepy whimpers. Emma stood watching him in the dim light, a hand pressed to her heart as she realized something profound: he wasn't running this time. He was staying in the dark with her. After the lights returned and the girls were finally asleep, she whispered something so soft he almost missed it. "Thank you for coming back." Nick didn't answer. He just looked at her, and in that moment, the silence between them was no longer made of pain. It was made of possibility. What neither of them said out loud, but both silently acknowledged, was that this wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the long road ahead, and the fact that, for the first time, they weren't walking it alone. By the time the twins were 4 months old, everything in Emma's world had quietly shifted. She wasn't entirely sure when it happened, when the lines between resentment and reluctant trust began to blur, but she could feel the change as tangibly as the seasons turning outside her window. The man who had once shattered her now moved through her apartment with steady hands and quieter steps. Nick had become part of the rhythm of their lives. He wasn't just showing up anymore. He was staying. Not with grand gestures or polished apologies, but in the small, essential ways that mattered most. It was the bottle he warmed at 2 a.m. without being asked. The way he cradled Sadie until her colic passed. The way he built shelves without needing her permission, but always asking for her input. And it was the way he had begun to learn Emma's silences, not to fill them, but to sit beside them until she was ready to speak. He never forced his presence, never pushed for more than she could give. But Emma found herself leaning toward him more often than away. She noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at the girls, how he sometimes lingered at the door after saying goodnight, almost like he was afraid she might change her mind and push him out again. And maybe, for a time, she had considered it. But now? Now she wasn't so sure. She was starting to see a different man from the one who had turned his back on her. This man had learned how to sit in discomfort without flinching. This man cried quietly the first time Hazel let out a real laugh. This man didn't talk about being a father, he simply became one. Emma still remembered vividly what it felt like to be betrayed, especially at her most vulnerable. The pain of carrying twins alone, delivering them without a hand to hold, waking up each night to feed them with no one but exhaustion for company, those memories hadn't faded. But they didn't burn the same way anymore. Because every time she looked at Nick, exhausted yet still standing by her side, a new memory was replacing the old ones. She remembered how he held Sky through a fever without sleeping. How he bought groceries and remembered what brand of baby lotion didn't cause rashes. How he sat cross-legged on the floor, reading the same storybook 10 times because Hazel liked the sound of one particular rhyme. These were the new truths she was building her life around. Nick, for his part, had stopped expecting forgiveness. Somewhere along the way, he realized that asking for Emma's heart was a privilege, not a right. So instead, he gave her space and time. He took freelance business projects he could do remotely and made her small town his home. He rented a modest apartment nearby, not pushing to move in with her, but never missing a single day. His suits were replaced by sweaters, and the hard edges of his voice softened with every diaper he changed and every smile Emma let slip without meaning to. He wasn't perfect. He still struggled with moments of doubt, still felt guilt when the twins cried for her and not him. But he didn't let that fear chase him away. For the first time in his life, he stayed. One afternoon, something shifted further. Emma had taken the girls for their 4-month checkup and invited Nick to come along. In the past, he would have arrived in a flurry of appointments and tension, but this time he was early, carrying the diaper bag and snacks and an extra change of clothes just in case. The pediatrician complimented how healthy the girls were, how bonded they seemed to both parents. Emma blushed at the word parents and waited for Nick to look uncomfortable, but he didn't. He just smiled, like hearing that label was the most natural thing in the world. On the way home, the girls fell asleep in their car seats, and the car filled with a rare kind of silence. Emma watched the road, then glanced at Nick. "They know you," she said quietly, her voice more fragile than she intended. "They recognize your voice." He didn't answer right away. His grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly. "I talk to them every night when they're asleep," he said. "Even if I can't stay, I call and leave messages. I want them to always know I'm trying." That night, after the girls were settled and the apartment dimmed, Emma poured 2 cups of tea and sat with him on the couch. There was no romantic tension between them, just something far more intimate, peace. She leaned her head back against the cushions, eyes closed. "I used to think I had to do everything alone," she admitted. "That needing help made me weak." Nick watched her for a long moment before answering. "I used to think success meant having no one who could leave you," he said. "I pushed people away before they had the chance. I thought that made me strong. But really, it just made me lonely. Emma opened her eyes and turned her head to look at him. The silence between them wasn't awkward this time. It was full of understanding. They had both spent years building walls to protect themselves. And now, brick by brick, those walls were coming down. She didn't reach for his hand. He didn't ask to stay the night. But when he left, he paused in the doorway and looked back, and Emma found herself smiling. Not because everything was perfect, but because something was healing. Something real. The next morning, she woke up to find a small envelope under the door. Inside was a note, handwritten, shaky but honest. No matter how slowly you let me in, I'll be here. I'm not running this time. Love, Dad. It wasn't signed with his name. It was signed with the identity he had finally embraced, not the CEO, not the success story, not the man who once walked away, but the father he had become. Emma folded the note and placed it in the drawer next to the girl's hospital bracelets and first baby photos. It didn't erase the past, but it reminded her that people could change, not in words, but in the way they chose to show up every single day. And Nick? He had become someone she didn't just trust with her daughters. She was starting, slowly, to trust him with her heart. Autumn arrived like a quiet storm, wrapping the small town in warm colors and early dusks. Leaves drifted from the trees in lazy spirals, and Emma found herself walking more often, pushing the stroller through the streets lined with gold and rust. The twins, now nearly 6 months old, had begun to giggle and babble more, each day revealing new pieces of their personalities. Sky was bold, reaching for everything, demanding attention with dramatic flair. Sadie was softer, observant, and calm, the kind of baby who studied your face for long moments like she was memorizing you. Together, they filled Emma's life with a kind of joy she hadn't known she needed, but also a deep, overwhelming exhaustion she could no longer mask. At first, she thought it was just normal tiredness. After all, she was raising 2 infants. But then came the headaches. The dizziness. The moments where she'd forget what she was saying mid-sentence. One morning she stood in the kitchen staring at an open refrigerator, unable to remember what she had gone in for. She ignored it at first, chalked it up to sleep deprivation. But it got worse. Nick noticed before she could hide it. One evening, as they were getting the girls ready for bed, Emma sat down suddenly, pale and shaking, gripping the edge of the couch with a quiet gasp. Nick knelt beside her, panic tightening his voice as he asked if she was okay. She tried to brush it off, but her hands trembled too much to be convincing. He insisted on taking her to the doctor the next morning. She didn't argue. She couldn't. A part of her was scared, and another part, bigger than she admitted, was relieved someone else was finally taking the wheel. Tests followed. Blood work. Scans. Hours of sitting in sterile waiting rooms, Nick always beside her, holding her hand when she let him, standing quietly when she didn't. When the diagnosis came, a temporary neurological condition caused by postpartum complications and anemia, Emma felt the room blur. The doctor's voice became background noise. All she could think about was the girls. What if she couldn't care for them? What if something happened? Nick stepped in immediately. Not just emotionally, but completely. He moved into the guest room without asking. He took leave from all his consulting jobs, arranged childcare support, and set up medication reminders and doctor follow-ups on his phone like it was second nature. He never made her feel weak. He never hovered in a way that took away her agency. Instead, he filled the gaps around her like glue, quietly holding the pieces together without forcing them back into place. He fed the girls in the middle of the night, paced with them when they cried, managed bath time and doctor's visits, and somehow still remembered to bring Emma tea in the evenings, the exact way she liked it. Emma tried not to cry in front of him, but one night, she couldn't stop herself. She was sitting in bed, her legs aching, her chest heavy with guilt. "I feel like I'm failing them," she whispered. Nick sat down at the foot of the bed and didn't rush to answer. He took her hand gently and waited until she looked at him. "You gave them life," he said. "You've loved them every second since. You've held on through pain most people would never survive. That's not failure, Emma. That's the kind of strength I never even understood until I watched you become their mother." His words didn't fix everything, but they reached something deep inside her. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the faint hum of the baby monitor beside them. The days that followed were difficult but strangely beautiful. Emma learned to let go. Not of her role as a mother, but of the need to do it all without help. She let Nick take the morning feedings while she slept an extra hour. She let him cook meals, messy but sincere. She allowed herself to cry when she needed to and smile when the girls giggled from their high chairs. Her recovery wasn't quick, but it was steady. And through every step, Nick was there, not out of obligation, but out of love. Not just for the girls, but for her. One evening, as the first snow threatened the edges of the air, Nick brought home a small Christmas tree. Emma laughed when he walked in with it, awkwardly wedged through the doorway. "It's early," she said. "It's not even Thanksgiving yet." He just smiled. "We missed too many firsts already. I don't want to miss this one." They decorated the tree together while the girls slept nearby, stringing soft lights and tiny ornaments that Nick had picked out carefully. 2 tiny photo frames dangled from the branches, one with Sadie's face, the other with Sky's. Emma stared at them for a long time, overwhelmed by how far they'd come. From hospital beds and silence to this quiet, glowing moment. As they stood side by side, admiring their work, Emma felt something shift. She turned to Nick, watching how the light danced across his face, and realized she didn't just see the man who had once hurt her. She saw the man who had stayed. Who had rebuilt trust not with promises, but with action. Who had proven, again and again, that redemption wasn't a word, it was a life you chose to live differently every day. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly, and it was the first time she'd said anything like that aloud. Nick looked at her, something raw and full behind his eyes. "There's nowhere else I want to be." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. In that moment, wrapped in the glow of a crooked tree and the sounds of sleeping babies, something deeper passed between them, a quiet, unspoken vow that they had already begun to build something real. Not perfect, but true. And sometimes, that was the beginning of everything. Winter melted into spring slowly, the snow pulling back from the sidewalks like a quiet retreat. Sunlight returned in golden stretches across the apartment floor, warming everything it touched. Emma had regained her strength by now, more than just physically. Her heart, once cracked by betrayal and loneliness, now felt full in a way that still startled her when she let herself stop and feel it. The twins were nearly 10 months old. They were crawling, laughing, beginning to mimic sounds, clapping their hands when music played. They had transformed from tiny, fragile beings into bright, curious little souls who filled every room with life. And through it all, Nick had remained, unchanged in his devotion, but changed in every other way. Emma had not made promises. She had not spoken of the future in sweeping declarations. But she had let him stay. She had allowed him into every part of their world. And in return, Nick had made himself a new man, one who no longer feared the messiness of emotion or the vulnerability of commitment. He had started his own company locally, not to return to corporate towers and boardrooms, but to build something flexible and meaningful, something that allowed him to be present. His office was a converted room in his apartment, but he spent more time at Emma's now than his own place. He came for breakfast, stayed through dinner, and sometimes left only when the girls were already asleep. Some nights, he didn't leave at all. The air was shifting. Emma knew it. She felt it in the way her hand found his automatically. In how she no longer tensed when he kissed her cheek. In the way their laughter no longer felt borrowed or cautious. It was theirs now. Something new they had grown from ashes. One morning, a soft rain fell outside the window, tapping gently against the glass like the beginning of a song. Emma stood in the kitchen, hair still damp from the shower, holding Sadie while Sky napped. Nick came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist without a word, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. They stood there for a long moment, watching the raindrops slip down the window. Emma leaned back into him. "We made it," she said softly, almost to herself. Nick didn't speak for a second. Then he turned her gently toward him, took Sadie in his arms with practiced ease, and said, "There's something I want to ask you." Later that day, when the sky had cleared and the sidewalks were glowing with rainlight, Nick brought Emma and the girls to the small lake just outside of town. It wasn't glamorous. There was no event, no stage, no crowd. Just the quiet ripple of water and the smell of spring in the air. But on the grass near the water's edge was a small picnic blanket, a basket, and a pair of silver rings resting inside an open storybook. It was the very book he used to read the girls, the one where the prince doesn't slay the dragon but learns to speak its language. Emma didn't need a speech. She didn't even need the question. But Nick knelt anyway, holding Hazel and Sky, because by now he could hold both like second nature, and he said, "I will never ask you to forget. But I will spend the rest of my life proving that I'm not the man who walked away. I'm the man who stayed. I'm the man who will stay. For you. For them. For everything we never got to have the first time." Emma stared at him, eyes shining, heart aching in the most beautiful way. She dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around all three of them, and whispered, "Yes." They didn't celebrate with champagne. They celebrated by dancing barefoot in the grass, the girls squealing in their arms, the wind tangling Emma's hair, Nick laughing the way she once thought he never could. It wasn't about a wedding or a ring. It was about what they had built from the ruins. A life. A family. Forgiveness. A second chance that looked nothing like a fairy tale but felt more real than anything she'd ever known. Later that night, when the girls were finally asleep, Emma and Nick sat on the couch, feet tangled under a blanket, the world outside quiet and still. Emma reached for his hand, held it in both of hers, and said, "You asked me for a second chance. But what we have now, this isn't a second chance. It's the first real one." And Nick, looking at the woman he had once lost and the home he had helped rebuild, knew in his soul that she was right. This wasn't redemption. This was a beginning. One they had earned with every tear, every sleepless night, every small kindness and every silent promise. And it was only just beginning.